Hello, I'm Jean Boase-Beier, and I'm the translations editor for ARC Publications. And I'm going to be talking to Richard Crockatt, who's Emeritus Professor at the University of East Anglia, where he taught American history, but he's also a translator from German. We're going to be talking about a book that we've published in our chapbook series. It's this, a small chapbook of the poems of Heinrich Heine. It's the North Sea poems translated by Richard, who, besides being a professor of American history, is also a translator from German. So, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you because you're going to read one or two poems, I think, aren't you?
Yes, I'm going to read three poems. The first one is, in fact, the first one in the selection, and it's called Dusk. And it's relatively short, but it sets the scene for the whole sequence. On the pale seashore, I sat alone with troubled thoughts. The sun dropped lower and cast glowing red streaks on the water, and the wide white waves, driven in by the flood, foamed and roared ever closer with a curious hissing, whispering and whistling, laughing and murmuring, sighing and seething. But through it all, the soothing sound of a lullaby, like an echo of long-lost legends, ancient treasured tales which I heard as a boy from the neighbors' children when we sat on summer evenings on the stone steps by the front door, squatting down to hear the stories with our tiny listening hearts and bright eager eyes, while the older girls sat beside fragrant flower pots over by the window, their faces like roses, smiling and bathed in moonlight. That's it. That one. And the next one I'm going to read is also fairly short, and it's I'm going to read this one firstly in German, and it's called Meeresstille or Calm Sea. Meeresstille, ihre Strahlen wirft die Sonne auf das Wasser. Und im bogenden Geschmeide zieht das Schiff die grünen Furchen. Bei dem Steuer liegt der Bootsmann auf dem Bauch und schnarcht leise. Bei dem Mastbaum, segelflickend, kauert der beteerte Schiffsjunge. Hinterm Schmutze seiner Wangen sprüht es rot. Wehmutig zuckt es um das breite Maul und schmerzlich schauen die großen, schönen Augen. Denn der Kapitän steht vor ihm, tobt und flucht und schilt ihm: Spitzbub, Spitzbub, ein Hering hast du aus der Tonne mir gestohlen. Meeresstille. Aus den Wellen taucht hervor ein kluges Fischlein, wärmt das Köpfchen in der Sonne, plätschert lustig mit dem Schwänchen. Doch die Möwe aus den Lüften schießt herunter auf das Fischlein, und den raschen Raub im Schnabel schwingt sie sich hinauf ins Blau. And this is the English version. Calm sea, the sun casts its rays upon the water, and through the jeweled waves the ship plows green furrows. By the helm lies the boatswain on his belly, snoring gently. At the mast, mending sails, crouches the tar-stained ship's boy. Behind the dirt on his cheeks, his skin's inflamed. There's grief in the grimace of his wide mouth and pain in his big, beautiful eyes. For the captain stands over him, raging, cursing, and calling him scoundrel. Scoundrel, you've stolen a herring out of the barrel. Calm sea. Out of the waves peeps a smart little fish, warms his head in the sun and splashes in fun with his tail. But a gull, swooping down on the fish from the heights, grabs him up in his beak and sweeps back up in a flash. I love that one. It's got a nice light touch to it. Mm-hmm. The next one and the third one is called Sea Spectre. People translate it differently. I call it Spectre rather than Sea Apparition. It's probably his best known poem in which his characteristic ploy of undercutting an imaginative projection happens, and it kind of undercuts his own imagination. But I was lying at the rail of the ship, looking down with dreamy eyes into the crystal clear water. Then deeper and deeper I looked, till deep down on the seabed, at first dim and cloudy, then gradually sharper and clearer, appeared church steeples and towers. And then, clear as daylight, a whole town, ancient and Dutch, teeming with people. Grave gentlemen dressed in black, with white ruffs and chains of office, long swords and long faces, stride through the crowded marketplace to the town hall steps, where stone images of emperors stand watch with scepter and sword. Nearby, past long rows of houses with mirror-bright windows and pyramid-shaped linden trees, young women saunter in rustling silks, slim of body, their faces like flowers, wearing modest black bonnets over long golden tresses. Young men in motley Spanish garb struck past and nod their greetings. Older women clad in old-fashioned brown, carrying hymn books and rosaries, hurry along with stumbling steps to the great cathedral, urged on by the peal of bells and the swelling sound of the organ. The far-off sounds fill me with a mysterious dread. Endless longing, deep sorrow seize my heart, my scarcely recovered heart. It's as though its wounds were being kissed by those dear lips and made to bleed again, hot red drops falling long and slow to an old gable house down there, sadly empty of human life, except that at a lower window a young girl sits, her head resting upon her arm, like a poor lost child. And I know you, poor lost child. So deep, sea deep indeed, you hid yourself from me out of a childish whim, no longer able to surface, but lived as a stranger among strangers for centuries. Meanwhile, with my heart full of grief, I searched the whole world for you, searched for you always, eternal beloved, long lost, found at last. I have found you and see again your sweet face, your wise, trusting eyes, your dear smile. Nevermore will I leave you, and I'm coming down to you with arms outstretched wide. I'll plunge down to your heart. But just in time, the captain seized me by the foot and pulled me back from the rail, crying out with a vexed laugh, "Doctor, are you mad?" I should say that doctor is Dr. Heine. He had a doctorate in law, actually, and that's why it's doctor. So those are 3 poems.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's always really good to hear them read out aloud rather than just reading them on the page. It obviously brings them to life in a different way. Yeah, I mean, so we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about these poems, or not really about these poems, but more about your translation of them. And I'd like to start by asking you how you came to choose to translate Heine.
Well, my connection with Heine goes back a long way, over 50 years, to when I was at school, first year 6. I had a German course in Freiburg for 3 weeks. And among the other things that happened there, we were required to, and encouraged, and I think required, to learn by heart poems of the great German poets, Goethe, Schiller, and also Heine. And I particularly took to Heine. And some of these poems I still have by heart, and they just stuck with me. In fact, I used to take, when I was traveling, I used to take a copy of his Buch der Lieder, or Book of Songs, with me in my backpack, and it just became part of the furniture of my mind, really. Another reason is that they are poems, sea poems. I mean, in a way, they're not about nautical subjects, but the sea is the backdrop in them. And it's not only that, but there's a sea at the Frisian island of Norderney. I have to say, one of the reasons I ended up translating these was purely contingent reason, that about 18 months ago, at the beginning of lockdown, I happened to be reading Erskine Childer's Riddle of the Sands, one of my favorite novels, and part of which takes place on the island of Norderney. And then I realized, of course, that the North Sea poems of Heine also are set in Norderney. So of such remote connections are results often made. I think also he's been translated many times before, but I wanted to encounter him personally, individually, because every time each person really has a different version of a poet, like Heine. I should say that I only consulted one other set of translations of Heine, and that was Emma Lazarus in the 19th century, so remote from my approach to translation that I could never be accused of copying her. And I didn't read any more recent ones because I wanted it to be a personal encounter, and I didn't want to have I'm a rather suggestible person. I didn't want to have suggestions made to me about how it should go. And so that's another thing. And finally, a reason is another sort of contingent reason. I was on the rebound from learning Russian, and I spent many years trying to learn Russian, quite a difficult language, but particularly difficult because I tried to do it in relatively old age, and it was such a struggle. Your memory goes, your flexibility of mind goes, and so on. And I realized I had this resource, which was German. I'd learned quite young. I was never bilingual. I was fairly fluent. I lived there for a while, and it was just there, ready to go. And I thought, again in lockdown, this was a good way of spending my time. And so I think it proved to be in the end, for me anyway. So those are some of the reasons. Some of them are to do with Heine. Some of them are just chance events which happen in life all the time.
Yeah, well, that's how these things come about, isn't it? So you decided to revisit Heine and to translate these particular poems. What about? Can you tell us something about the problems of translating them? I mean, were there any kind of particular problems that kept recurring, or not? Can you say something about that?
Yes, well, I would start in a slightly more general way by saying that at one level, the experience of translating Heine is the same experience any translator has of trying to make what sounds natural in one language sound natural in another language, and that's no easy thing. And then there's a question of what natural means. Is it natural according to Heine's time, or a natural according to our own way of language? Way of speaking? And what you end up with, what I ended up with, is some notion of equivalence, I suppose. I'm trying to produce a modern equivalent of what I think Heine might have written if he'd been alive now, as it were, and yet without losing that sense that this is a historical product, you know, or a historical entity. The poem is a historical thing, 200 years old or more. It's a rather complex process, and I have to say, for me, I'm not a theorist of translation, as you are. If I went into it too deeply, I'd probably get very confused. But I want it to be read as a poem, a modern poem that people can feel happy with now, not an archaic. I want to get rid of archaicism. And interestingly, Heine was a great opponent of archaicism and disliked it intensely. As for specifically Heine's poems and these particular poems, in one sense, you might say, oh, he has an easy ride because they're not rhymed, you know, and a lot of his output is rhymed quatrains and very tight. In fact, it's the only sustained amount of free verse in his entire output, as far as I'm aware. But that's deceptive. Heine is very careful about rhythm, about sound, about alliteration, repetition, everything that you might come under the heading of the music of poetry. And of course, I use the word music advisedly because many of his poems, the shorter poems particularly, were set to music. There are about 3,000 versions of his poems. It's staggering in music, musical song form. And so uh, you have to be able to follow the shifts of tone and shifts of register and shifts of rhythm in this so-called free verse. And of course, the shifts of tone are vitally important. He gets very close to melodrama, he gets close to sentimentality, often to an excessive degree almost, or he gets close to excess, and then he undercuts himself mercilessly. And the question, how serious is he? Is it a joke? Is it funny? Is it supposed to be funny? All these issues of register and tone are difficult, and you make choices and you have to stick with them. And I'm just hoping that they come out well for me. My feeling is that he had a lot of natural gusto and humor, and but yet he was also very serious. In fact, he was full of contradictions, and that's one of the attractions, as I'll come on to later on.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because you say, and I mean, this is translators often do say this, that you want to translate something so that it sounds as though Heine had been writing today. So that it sounds as though it could have been Heine writing this in English today, if one can imagine such a a fantastic situation. But of course, he wasn't writing today, and it is also of its time, because the themes are of their time, and the sort of irony you find is the sort of irony that which only works in a sense against the basis of what was being written at the time. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, or one of the other things, was what do you think is the particular appeal of Heine for a modern reader, for somebody reading him today in your translation?
I'll preface that by saying, picking up your point about irony, he is a romantic poet, but he's also an anti-romantic, or a critique of romanticism, and that seems to me that the core of his approach in these poems. And that also seems to me to help to account for his appeal to modern readers. I'm going to give you two little vignettes to try and illustrate what I mean. One is a scene. Imagine his grave at Montmartre Cemetery, which I visited a number of times. The last time I went there was a German family there from Düsseldorf, which is where he was born. Father was reading the poems to the children and saying, "This is very important, you must listen, this is one of our great poets." And I also noticed that the city of Düsseldorf keeps fresh flowers on his grave all the time. Staggering. That's one little vignette. Heine, almost the national treasure of Germany. Second vignette, 13th of December, 1971, Heine's birthday. I'm living in Frankfurt. There's a Heine birthday celebration put on by the local Communist Party. And among the visitors sitting in serried ranks on the stage are members of the Politburo from the East German state of the DDR. Staggering. And this is another Heine, friend of Karl Marx, radical on the left, very political, and yet and a darling of the left, as he was hated by the right. I mean, he was very prominent among those who were whose books were being burned by the Nazis in 1934. But that scene of his birthday in Frankfurt is amusing, because there was serried ranks of stony-faced Politburo members from East Germany, completely out of keeping, it seems to me, with the spirit, the restless, ironic, dangerous spirit of Heine. But they represent these two. These are not representative. They're just two. They show the diversity of possible responses. But I think the fact is, it's his diversity which has the appeal. He's lyrical, he's traditionally poetic, He could tell a story. He did tell stories endlessly. He was full of contradictions, and we moderns love contradiction. We exist in contradictions, and we identify with them to some extent. And there's an interesting comment by a modern critic, a contemporary mid-century, 20th century critic, who said that Heine displayed, and I'll quote here, a disunity of mood, which he said was detrimental to poetry. I think completely the opposite. I think he did show a disunity of mood, but it's a peculiarly modern sensibility that shows different registers, different moods. And indeed, although I wouldn't in any sense call him a modernist in the sense of Eliot Pound and so on, because he wasn't an experimenter on the form in their way, he was modern in that sense of the disunity of his mood and the diversity of his character and so on, which he exploited poetically. So, in other words, he's unmistakable of his time, but I think he has a restless modern sensibility.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting, isn't it, that at the time he was writing, small books were actually banned in Germany because books of this size, you know, were considered to be subversive because people read them, and people didn't read larger books. And his publisher had to try and publish larger books in order, I mean, not just by Heine, but in general, in order that they would pass the censor. So, you know, and I mean, Heine fitted into that very well because he was seen as very revolutionary and actually quite dangerous. So it's interesting that this particular collection has come out in this chapbook form, you know, which would have been banned at the time he was writing. I think that's really quite interesting.
That's
good. Interesting.
He did have endless issues with his publisher, and they came to blows or metaphorical blows on many occasions, because he was always pushing, but the publisher knew he had to pass everything through the censor, and the censors were very strict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is very interesting, and you know, for me it was interesting to sort of revisit Heine and see how you've translated him and see things that I hadn't seen in him before. So this is one of the really fascinating things, of course, about translation. Which brings me actually to the final question. Do you have plans to translate either more of Heine or more of somebody else, or maybe even from other languages? Maybe you're going to translate from Russian? Or
most unlikely, for reasons I'll explain right at the end. But I would like to publish the whole of the North Sea cycle. This is about half of it. And there's also a third section, which is a prose. And I've done a version of the whole thing. I just like to explore it more fully and write an introduction and so on. The prose section is very interesting because it starts off as a meditation on Norderney and the fishing communities there and so on, but ends up as in typical Heine way in his prose as a meditation on the whole of German culture, and particularly of Goethe and his role and position in German history and culture. It's quite fascinating, typically slightly irritating that he goes off on tangents, but on the other hand, again, that's what makes it exciting and interesting. So that's one possibility. I'm thinking about that. Yes, whether it'll be published or not, I don't know. The other thing I have in mind, and this may not be for publication, is just to produce an anthology of the poems I like best in German. And there are quite a lot, and some of them are very difficult, by Rilke and so on. But it's a way of getting inside the literature, and which is unmatched. It's almost like you get it in more deeply than you do in poems in your own language, because you have to work so much harder. At least I do. The only other thing I have in mind, you can see I'm not a literary scholar. I like what I like, and I know what I like, etc., whatever the phrase is. And the other idea I have, a piece of prose, is to do a translation of Thomas Mann's Tonio Kröger, which has always been a kind of talismanic piece for me for lots of reasons. And of course, it's been done before, and actually some of the recent translations very good, very well. But again, you ask, why do another one? Why do another recording of Beethoven's sonata? You know, it's just because it's there and because I'd like to know more about it and do my version of it. And I suppose what it comes down to is that I only feel that one should translate things that you know extremely well and that you're almost by heart. And I know it's possible to do it differently, but that's the way I am. These things hover around in your mind as the translation doesn't just take place in the study and on the paper. It takes place as you're walking around and thinking and weighing the words and thinking, how could that go and how could this go? So it's not an agenda for a great professional career in translation, but that's my agenda.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting, and I do agree that it's good to work on things that you know almost by heart, because you can think about them when you're not working on them, and that's a big advantage.
Yes.
Well, thanks for talking to me about that, and thank you to everybody who is listening. At least I hope people are listening and will listen. And bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.